They were the first generation nobody was watching. Not neglected, exactly. Just unsupervised in a way that left a mark. They grew up before the world decided children needed to be protected from it. There is a tendency to describe the 1970s as a simpler time. A looser time. A time of greater freedom for children, when kids ranged freely and came home when the streetlights came on. This is partly true. But the freedom was not curated freedom. It was not freedom as a parenting philosophy. It was freedom as the default state when adults were otherwise occupied with their own. The 1970s were, for the adults in them, a decade of profound cultural and personal disruption. Divorce rates surged. Women entered the workforce in large numbers. Counterculture values dissolved traditional structures. The children of this decade were not at the center of that renegotiation. They were present for it, sometimes caught in it, often unsupervised during it. They absorbed its textures without being explained its terms. What they became as adults bears the imprint of that era in specific and traceable ways. Not as damage, necessarily, but as a particular set of orientations, toward authority, toward self-reliance, toward risk, toward. They learned to handle things themselves. Not because someone told them to, but because there was often no one to tell. They learned, in the particular way of the 1970s child, that adults were complicated, that institutions were not to be fully trusted, that happiness was something you made yourself rather than something that was owed. Understanding the psychology of people who grew up in the 1970s requires understanding the specific texture of that era. Not as nostalgia, but as a developmental environment that shaped specific capacities, specific anxieties, and, because the shaping was real, it left traces. The person who learned to navigate a loosely supervised childhood in a decade of adult upheaval carries something forward. A particular relationship with freedom, with responsibility. That something is not easy to name, but it is recognizable. Other people who grew up in that era recognize it immediately, the way people who grew up in the same weather recognize the same. Imagine you are 8 years old, and it is a summer afternoon in 1974. Nobody knows exactly where you are, and this is not unusual. You left the house after breakfast, and nobody asked where you were going. You are somewhere in the neighborhood, several blocks from home possibly, and no one knows exactly where. You have a loose group of neighborhood kids and a general understanding that you should come back for dinner. In between, the world is entirely yours. You have no phone, no schedule, no adult supervision. You are solving problems as they arise, navigating disputes, finding food, dealing with older kids who assert themselves over younger ones. You are 10, and the television is on a lot. The news is complicated. Watergate is happening, or has happened, and even though you do not fully understand it, you understand the adult's tone when you are 12, and your parents are separating, or someone at school's parents are separating, or divorce is simply a newly ambient fact of life. What was permanent, you are learning, is not permanent. You are 13, and you are watching television shows with values that your parents' generation would have found scandalous 10 years earlier. The culture is moving fast. You are 14, and you are given a kind of latitude that later generations would not be given. You are taking public transit alone. You are spending evenings away from home. You are 15, and you have learned a specific lesson about authority. It is human. The adults who hold it are fallible, sometimes hypocritical, capable of being wrong. Watergate taught you this. You are 16, and you are more competent than teenagers in later decades will be allowed to become. Not because you are more talented, but because more has been asked of you, and you have. You are 17, and you notice that the world expects something from you. Not protection or nurturing. The world has not been nurturing, but participation. You are expected to figure it out. You are 18 and you leave home. Nobody has an elaborate plan for your launch. You go. You are not particularly anxious about going. You are 22, and you have opinions about institutions that your parents' generation did not arrive at until much later, if they arrived at them at all. You are 28, and you notice that you solve problems differently than people who were raised more protectively. You try things. You improvise. You are 35, and you have a child, and something in you is trying to give them more than you were given. More supervision. More structure. More protection. The psychological literature on the 1970s as a developmental environment is scattered. It does not cluster neatly under a single theory, because the decade itself did not produce a single story. What those conditions had in common was a particular degree of child autonomy, a particular degree of adult distraction, and a cultural moment in which the old rules about how families should function were being. Developmental psychologists studying resilience, particularly work by Emmy Werner and others on children who thrive despite difficult circumstances, have found that children who develop genuine autonomy and problem-solving skills through early experience of the 1970s child was not, by most measures, growing up in managed adversity, but the unmanaged kind, the kind that came from benign neglect, from adult preoccupation, from the simple logistical reality of the capacity for self-direction, the tolerance for uncertainty, the comfort with improvisation, the understanding, developed early, that waiting for someone to solve your problem was often a less efficient strategy than solving it yourself. These are genuine strengths. They are also connected to genuine difficulties. The same person who can function independently in uncertain conditions often struggles to ask for help. There is also a specific relationship with institutions that characterizes many people who grew up in the 1970s. The decade was, in a sense, one long lesson in institutional failure. Watergate, Vietnam, the end. Research on political trust and generational cohorts has consistently found that attitudes formed during adolescence tend to persist. The generation that came of age watching institutional authority fail tends to maintain a skeptical relationship with. This skepticism has been both a strength and a limitation. It produced a generation that was not easily manipulated by appeals to authority. There is also a specific relationship with emotional life. The 1970s were, in the dominant culture, a decade of significant emotional opening. The human potential movement, therapy culture, the idea that one's feelings were. The children of the 1970s often grew up in households where feelings were more visible than they had been in the previous generation, but where the tools for processing those feelings were still being. This produced a specific pattern: emotional awareness without emotional fluency. Many people who grew up in this era are acutely aware of their own and others' emotional states, the legacy of attuning to complicated. They know something is wrong before they can say what. They can read a room with precision. They have difficulty sometimes locating the right language for what they are perceiving or the right relationship in. Think about what it would mean to grow up in an era before emotional vocabulary was widely available, before boundaries and attachment styles and processing were common parlance. For many people who grew up in the 1970s, the feelings are there. The intelligence to perceive them is there. The generation-specific gap is often in the tools for working with them, tools that. The concept most useful for understanding the psychological legacy of the 1970s childhood is not trauma in the clinical sense. Most people who grew up in that era did not experience clinical trauma. Adult unavailability is not the same as neglect. Neglect implies malice or indifference. What many 1970s children experienced was something more ambiguous. Parents who were present but preoccupied, adults who were available in some. Developmental psychologists studying the effects of parental preoccupation, as distinct from outright absence, have found that the consequences are significant but subtle. Secure dependency is not weakness. It is the capacity to ask for help, to accept support, to form the kind of deep reliance that intimate relationships require. It develops through repeated experience of reliable caregiving. This is the legacy for many people who grew up in the 1970s. Not the inability to function, quite the opposite. There is also the matter of cultural context. The 1970s were, in significant ways, a decade of transition from one set of cultural values to another, and children who grew up in transitional. The flexibility comes from having grown up in a world that was rewriting its rules. The instability comes from having grown up without a consistent rule set to internalize. Research on generational cohorts, work by William Strauss and Neil Howe, and later by Jean Twenge and others, has documented how the historical moment of one's childhood shapes values, expectations, and psychological tendencies. People who came of age in the 1970s, those born roughly between 1963 and 1972, straddle the designation of late baby boomers and early Generation X. That quality of being forgotten, of having been raised in the gaps of adult attention, is not simply a deficit. It produced a self-reliance that has genuine value. You are 40, and you are at a parent-teacher conference, and the teacher is describing your child's needs with a specificity and attentiveness that makes you feel, briefly and unexpectedly, something like grief. You are 42, and someone at a dinner party describes their own 1970s childhood, and you recognize it immediately. The particular texture of it, the particular freedom, and the particular aloneness, the sense of. You are 44, and a therapist asks about your relationship with your parents, and you find yourself saying something you had not previously put in words. They were good people. You are 46, and you are surprised to find yourself struggling with something at work, a situation you cannot simply navigate through on your own, and you notice the specific difficulty of asking. You are 48, and you are watching your children navigate a highly structured, highly supervised world. Their schedules are full. Their challenges are mediated. You are 50, and you are at a reunion of some kind, and the people around you from this era carry something you recognize. A particular posture. A particular irony. You are 52, and you are trying to explain to someone younger what it was like to grow up when you did. The lack of seat belts, the unsupervised summers, the smoking adults, You are 54, and you are noticing that you do not easily receive care. When someone tries to take care of you, genuinely, with attention and intention, something in you deflects it. You are 56, and you are realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the self-reliance you developed as a child was not a neutral tool. It came with specific costs. You are 58, and you are reading about the 1970s and finding yourself described in the description of a generation. This is strange. You thought you were just you. You are 60, and someone asks what you are most proud of from your life, and you give the standard answers. You are 62, and you are beginning to be honest with yourself about what the freedom cost. Not that it was all cost. You are 64, and you are in a therapy session that is going deeper than therapy sessions usually go, and the therapist says something about the longing underneath the competence, and you do not argue. You are 66, and you are watching the world your grandchildren are growing up in, monitored, structured, protected, and you feel two things simultaneously. Relief that they have more scaffolding than you did. You are 68, and you are finally saying something to someone about what it was like to be a child in the 1970s. Not the television and the music and the cultural nostalgia, but you are 70, and you have spent your adult life being capable. Professionally capable. Relationally capable. Capable in ways that sometimes looked from the outside like ease but were actually the result of decades of. You are 72, and you notice that it is easier now to say when something is hard. The defenses are lower. The need to appear to be handling it is less acute. You are 74, and you are thinking about what you will leave behind, not possessions but orientations. The specific way you move through the world. The competence and the hunger. You are 76, and you understand now that the 1970s child was not more resilient than children before or after. They were differently shaped. You are 78, and you are talking to your grandchild, and they ask what your childhood was like. You try to explain. You are 80, and you realize that what you are describing to your grandchild is not a complaint. It is, in its complicated way, a gratitude. You are 82, and you are thinking about the children you knew in those unsupervised years. The kids who figured it out, who improvised, who developed judgment through the particular school of being left. You are 84, and you feel the weight of being one of the last to carry this particular texture. The 1970s childhood is receding. The children of that era are aging. You are 86, and you are at peace with most of it. Not all. The aloneness still has its residue. The hunger for the care that was not consistently available still surfaces sometimes in the you are 88, and you understand that you were shaped by your era the way everyone is shaped by their era. Without choosing it, without fully knowing it was happening, and with results that you are 90, and you have lived long enough to see several eras come and go. Each one produced its children. Each one left its marks. The marks you carry are yours. You are 92, and you are sitting in a room full of your contemporaries, and you feel the specific solidarity of having been shaped by the same weather. You do not need to explain. What you built in those unsupervised years was not nothing. It was something durable and genuinely yours, a relationship with the world that did not depend on being guided through it. What you wished for, sometimes, was someone to guide you through it anyway. Both things are true. Both things have always been true. The era produced you. You also produced yourself. That is the paradox every 1970s child carries, and it is, in the end, not so different from the paradox every person carries, though the specific. The contrast between the world people who grew up in the 1970s inhabited and the world their children and grandchildren inhabit is stark enough to constitute a genuine cultural discontinuity. The contemporary childhood, structured, supervised, scheduled, digitally mediated, is organized around child safety and child development in ways that the 1970s childhood was not. This reorganization was not arbitrary. But the reorganization also had costs that are now beginning to be documented. Research by Jonathan Haidt and others has linked the intensive supervision and scheduling of contemporary childhood to higher rates of anxiety, lower. This research resonates with many people who grew up in the 1970s, not because they are romantic about their own childhood, but because they can feel in their own nervous systems the specific product of. The irony is precise. The generation that was given the most freedom and the least scaffolding has raised the generation that has been given the most scaffolding and the least freedom. Social media has added a layer of complexity to this picture. The generation that grew up without being watched has raised children who are, in some sense, watched constantly, by peers, by algorithms, by the psychological effects of growing up under surveillance versus growing up under minimal observation are significant and only beginning to be properly studied. People who grew up in the 1970s carry, as one of their generation-specific legacies, a strong intuition of the value of being unobserved. This intuition may be among the most valuable things their era produced. The capacity for genuine privacy, not the absence of social media, but the psychological disposition towards selfhood that does not. It is also something that can still be cultivated. The 1970s childhood is not a prerequisite for an unobserved interior, but the generation that had that childhood may have something to teach. The people who grew up in the 1970s were not the products of a better or worse era. They were the products of a specific era, one with specific freedoms and specific. What they carry is the imprint of that specificity. The self-reliance that is also a difficulty with need. The skepticism that is also a difficulty with trust. The era gave them something that cannot be manufactured and cannot be taken back. It gave them an unmediated relationship with difficulty, an early education in their own capacity. That something deserves to be named, not as nostalgia, not as complaint, but as honest acknowledgement of what a specific developmental environment produced in specific people, a generation that grew up in. They were the first generation nobody was watching. They figured it out anyway. In the figuring out, they became who they are, marked by their era, exceeding it, carrying it forward into